Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and a landmark judgment that was delivered yesterday by the Delhi High Court in connection to cases filed under this act. See, the UAPA or the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act was enacted in 1967 primarily to deal with unlawful activities which could threaten the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation. This law was enacted in the backdrop of the grave national security threats that India faced in the 1960s, particularly the external wars with China and Pakistan, and rising internal divide within the country due to regionalism and communalism. As these developments were deemed to be a security threat for the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation, a committee of the National Integration Council recommended the enactment of a dedicated law by the Parliament to deal with all these so-called unlawful activities. As a result, in 1967, the UAPA was enacted by the Parliament in order to act against any activities that could threaten the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation. But a couple of decades later, as India started dealing with the threat of terrorism, which was also seen as a national security threat and a threat to the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation, India came out with a few laws in the 1980s and 1990s to deal with these acts of terrorism. First, we had the notorious TADA or the Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, which was brought out in 1985-87. This law was brought in to primarily deal with Khalistan terrorism that India was battling in the state of Punjab, and this law was applicable for a period of 1985 to 1995. This law that was brought in to deal with terrorism became extremely unpopular and controversial due to some of its provisions, which gave tremendous powers to police agencies and security agencies. And quite often, in the name of counterterrorism, these laws and provisions were being misused to violate human rights and fundamental rights. So, because of its controversial nature, TADA was allowed to lapse in 1995 and it was not renewed by the Parliament. Then came the POTA as a replacement to TADA. POTA stands for Prevention of Terrorist Activities Act, which was brought out in 2002. This act was in place just for 2 years and later it was repealed by the Parliament, again due to a similar controversy. POTA was also considered to be a draconian law, which gave tremendous powers to police and security agencies, which was often being misused, leading to the grave violation of human rights and fundamental rights. So with the lapse of TADA and with the repealing of POTA, India did not have a specific law to deal with terrorism. That too at a time when terrorism was emerging as India's biggest security threat, that too state-sponsored terrorism. So in 2004, the UAPA was amended by the central government to make this the primary legal weapon of India against terrorism. Essentially, many of the controversial provisions of POTA were brought in, and even though POTA itself was repealed, these provisions were included indirectly under the UAPA to make this India's primary law against terrorism. Then over the years, the UAPA has been amended several times to give more strength to this law in order to enable India effectively counter the threat of terrorism. The 2004 amendment introduced many of the POTA provisions indirectly into the UAPA, and this law, which was never meant to deal with modern-day terrorism, was turned into India's primary legal weapon against terror through such amendments. Then in 2008, following the Mumbai attacks of 26/11, the law was further strengthened to give more powers to security and law enforcement agencies, and this clearly made the UAPA India's primary legal weapon against terror. Then again in 2012, the law was amended to include provisions of terror financing as per obligations under the FATF or the Financial Action Task Force. And recently in 2019, the law was again amended, which even led to a controversy because now it was not just organizations which could be designated as terrorist organizations, but even individuals could be designated as terrorists under the UAPA. The previous amendments had enabled the Ministry of Home Affairs to designate extremist radical groups as terrorist groups, and now with the latest amendment, even individuals could be designated as terrorists. Along with that, the 2019 amendment gave even more powers to law enforcement agencies such as the NIA. And while such provisions were needed to fight terrorism effectively, it also raised several questions and controversies because India's experience with anti terror laws has been that in most cases, these laws and provisions are often misused by the government, the police, and the security agencies to even target activists, opposition leaders, students, and protesters in the name of countering terrorism and in the name of defending national security. So these laws, such as TADA and POTA, which previously existed, and now the UAPA, they have always triggered a debate between right to protest as a fundamental right and the tendency of the police and the government to label any critical activity against the government as terrorist activity. The biggest drawback of these laws, including the UAPA, is that it provides for very vague definitions. It doesn't even clearly define what is terrorism. This vagueness in definition adds to the discretionary powers enjoyed by the police and law enforcement agencies. And as it always happens, when there is such excessive discretion, it often gets misused at the ground level, either by the local officials or with the support of the government itself. These discretionary provisions are often misused to target any form of dissent, criticism, and opposition against the government, and even constitutionally guaranteed fundamental rights, such as the right to peacefully protest, is curbed by labeling them as terrorist activities that could threaten the integrity of the nation. Now, this law and its misuse came in for heavy criticism from the Delhi High Court yesterday in a case related to the Delhi riots that took place last year. As you might know, last year there were massive protests in the country against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and eventually these protests and counter-protests led to the breakout of communal riots in Delhi last year. So while investigating these cases, the Delhi police had arrested several students, political activists, and even social workers, and they had been charged under the rigorous provisions of the UAPA, which basically labeled their democratic protests as terrorist activities. According to the Delhi police, these students and activists, they had encouraged protests against the government of India in the name of protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And while the Delhi police sought to make a link between these protests and the communal riots that later broke out, they ended up labeling these protests as terrorist activities which could be charged and punished under the stringent UAPA. The UAPA is a very stringent law because once you're charged under it, it becomes almost impossible to obtain bail. And it not only provides for stringent punishment, but it also places a heavy burden on the accused to prove their innocence. Several legal experts, civil society activists, and the courts themselves, they have pointed out repeatedly the shortcomings of laws such as UAPA and how these provisions are often misused by the ruling government with the help of police and law enforcement to label protests and dissent as acts of terrorism. So in this case, the Delhi High Court has heavily criticized the functioning of the Delhi police and the manner in which they have invoked the provisions of UAPA against protesters and dissenters. The Delhi High Court has clearly sought to make a distinction between the right to protest, which is a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution, with terrorist activity. The Delhi High Court has cautioned that the frivolous application of this law has blurred or eroded the thin line that exists between right to protest and terrorist activity, and this represents a grave threat to the Indian democracy. Because fundamental rights, such as right to peaceful protest, is at the very heart and the foundation of a democracy. And if the government and the police, if they seek to curb these basic rights by clubbing them as terrorist activities, then it would lead to the very death of the democracy. While making these serious observations, the Delhi High Court has sought to make a clear distinction between acts of terrorism, criminal acts, and the right to protest, even to disrupt law and order in certain extreme cases. In its ruling, the Delhi High Court has made references to the earlier judgments of the Supreme Court, especially in the Hitendra Vishnu Thakur case, where the Supreme Court had held that a terrorist activity does not merely arise by causing disturbance of law and order or public order. See, the Constitution guarantees the fundamental right to protest as long as it is peaceful. This fundamental right, guaranteed under Article 19, of course, comes with reasonable restrictions. This is not an absolute right. Now, it's very much possible that many protests do not remain peaceful entirely, and in certain circumstances, they might even turn violent. It might result in a law and order situation, and it might disrupt public order. So these incidents, they have to be treated as criminal acts. They have to be charged under existing relevant provisions of the IPC, the Indian Penal Code, and other laws. Now, the police and the government, they cannot seek to label violent protests and even criminal acts as terrorist acts just because there was a disruption caused to law and order and public order. The High Court has clearly pointed out that the UAPA has been misused repeatedly, and this is a direct result of the wide and vague definition of terrorist act provided under UAPA. The judiciary has pointed out that terrorism is a heinous crime which seeks to strike fear in the society through indiscriminate killings. Terrorists, they do not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, and they don't even hesitate to attack civilian targets, and they seek to cause maximum destruction and maximum damage. Acts of terrorism are designed to bring out political messages, and quite often acts of terrorism are backed by hostile states and their intelligence agencies. So special laws such as UAPA are needed to deal with such inhuman acts of violence, as the existing ordinary laws are not sufficient to deal with the scope of terrorism. But however, these anti-terror laws, they are not meant for criminal activities. They are not meant for protests which might turn violent or which might disrupt law and order. Hence, the court has clearly pointed out that all terrorists are criminals, but all criminals cannot be treated as terrorists. And the right to protest and dissent against the government, either peaceful or violent, they cannot be clubbed with terrorism under UAPA, because such frivolous application of the law will undermine the very intent of the law. So the court has urged the police, law enforcement agencies, and the government to exercise maximum caution while using the term terrorism for conventional offences, and it has asked them to desist from unnecessarily invoking the provisions of UAPA for regular crimes or for dealing with protests and law and order incidents. Now let's take up a column from page number 6, in which the writer Stanley Johnny evaluates the disastrous war of the United States in Afghanistan. See, the American war in Afghanistan has become its longest involvement that has stretched and dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Following the 9/11 attacks of 2001, the US declared a global war on terrorism to target the Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, who were held responsible for the 9/11 attacks. As the Al-Qaeda and its leader were sheltered by the then Taliban government in Afghanistan, the US demanded the Afghan government to cooperate in this global war on terror. But the Taliban, as expected, refused to cooperate with the US, and they sought to shield Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. This led the United States to declare war on Afghanistan itself, and with the approval of the UN Security Council, the US led a coalition force to invade Afghanistan. Now the target for the US was not just Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but the Taliban government itself became a target. Following this invasion of Afghanistan, the coalition troops led by US and the NATO, they quickly defeated the Taliban and toppled the Taliban government, thereby achieving their short-term objectives. But however, the US would go on to commit grave mistakes and blunders, which would eventually turn this war into the longest war of the United States. Today, the United States is staring at a withdrawal, and as per the US-Taliban peace deal that was signed last year under the Donald Trump administration, the American troops are being pulled out, and by this year's September, all the American troops would have been withdrawn from Afghanistan. The terms of the deal make it very clear that the Taliban today has re-emerged into a much stronger position, and as the American troops are retreating, Taliban has started increasing its hold over Afghanistan. Today, nearly 22% of Afghan's districts are directly under the control of Taliban. The Afghan civilian government, which the US government had installed, barely controls around 24% of Afghan territory, and the rest of Afghanistan is contested between the government forces and the Taliban. Strategic experts believe that nearly 60 to 70% of Afghanistan is under the influence of Taliban today, thereby marking a strong re-emergence of this radical outfit. The US entered this war in 2001 with two main objectives. One was to defeat terrorism and counter terror groups like the Al Qaeda, and the other was to throw out Taliban from power and establish a civilian democratic government. But today, as the US retreats from Afghanistan, neither of the objectives have been achieved, and terrorism not only flourishes along the Afghanistan Pakistan border, but it has also spread to the neighboring regions with the emergence of several branches of Al Qaeda and with the rise of new terror outfits such as the Islamic State. The Taliban, on the other hand, which was once defeated and thrown out, has managed to stage a strong resurgence, and it successfully got into a position where it could dictate terms to the US itself under the terms of the peace deal. And as expected, the Taliban is well on its way to capture power in Afghanistan. In this context, the writer points out that the United States committed three grave mistakes in its Afghan strategy. The first mistake was that when the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, it failed to learn lessons from Afghanistan's history. Experts have always pointed out that Afghanistan has been a graveyard of empires. Back in the 1800s, Britain, that is British India, which feared a Russian invasion through Afghanistan, dispatched troops to Afghanistan to topple the then ruler of Afghanistan. In this Anglo-British war, the mighty British Empire was eventually defeated by the Pashtuns, who are the native ethnic group of the region, and their long history of conflict and hardship has made them battle-hardened. The Pashtuns today, who are found along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, they fought back against the British and Indian troops, and they successfully defeated the British Empire. Then, in 1979, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and annexed Afghanistan for a brief period. While the Soviets annexed Afghanistan to prevent American influence in the country, this opportunity was exploited by the United States, which launched its covert proxy war against the Soviet Union by working with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. These countries got together to sponsor the Pashtuns, and the Pakistani army and its intelligence agency, the ISI, would go on to nurture the Afghan Mujahideen with funding and supply of weapons from Saudi Arabia and the US in order to resist and throw out the Soviet occupying forces. For nearly a decade, from 1979 to 1989, the Afghan Mujahideen would wage an insurgent war against the occupying Soviet forces, and eventually the Soviet Union was defeated and it retreated its forces. This marked the second defeat of an empire in Afghanistan. So now when the Americans invaded Afghanistan in 2001, they should have obviously learnt lessons from history. They should have been aware of the dangers of funding radical terrorism for their geopolitical purposes, and they should have kept in mind the battle-hardened spirit of the Pashtuns. While in the short term, the US succeeded in throwing out Taliban from power, it failed to capitalize on this short-term success, and it quickly lost sight of its near-term objectives. Initially, the American objective was to counter terrorism, target groups like Al Qaeda, and to throw out the Taliban from power. These objectives had been achieved within a few months after invading Afghanistan in 2001. Following this near-term success, the US should have withdrawn from the region by allowing regional powers to stabilize the country. Instead, the United States was driven by the greed of its capitalism and with its agenda of exporting democracy, and it tried to replace the Taliban government with the Afghan civilian government. While this prolonged stay of American forces was needed to strengthen the Afghan civilian government, it was also very important for the US to withdraw from the region at the right time. But instead, the US went in for prolonged deployment without acting against the remnants of the Taliban, and parallelly, it lost its focus on Afghanistan due to the illegal invasion of Iraq. US, UK, and other NATO powers invaded Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein's government in 2003, and this unnecessary war in Iraq drained American resources and it led US to lose focus on Afghanistan. This gave enough opportunity for the Taliban to reorganize along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border with direct support of Pakistan. The US made a mistake here as well by taking Pakistan for granted and by ignoring and neglecting Pakistan's double game. The ISI capitalized on the opportunity Because for Pakistan, the Taliban has always been an asset to target India and weaken Indian influence. Because as long as the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan, it would enable Pakistan's ISI to nurture various anti India terror outfits as a part of its covert war against India. So between 2003 and 2010, the Taliban got enough opportunity and enough support from Pakistan to regroup and reorganize. And now it managed to stage a resurgence and it started targeting the American and the foreign forces with deadly precision. So post 2010, the American forces and the NATO coalition was dragged into an insurgent war. And by 2020, the foreign troops, including the American troops, had more or less conceded defeat. Then the US committed its third biggest mistake by surrendering to the terms of the Taliban when the peace deal was worked out last year. See, since a few years, for every American president, bringing back American troops from Afghanistan was the topmost priority. Because this long drawn out war of US in Afghanistan had become very unpopular back home in the US. And after having lost thousands of soldiers, the American people were demanding their government to withdraw from this conflict and bring back their troops. So every president, from Obama to Donald Trump to Biden, made their best attempts to bring back American troops, and the only option available for them was to talk to the Taliban and negotiate a deal with the Taliban, as it had managed to stage a complete resurgence. The initial talks between the Obama administration and the Taliban failed to give out any desired results, but Donald Trump opened direct channels with Taliban, and in these negotiations, the Afghan civilian government itself was bypassed by the US, as the Taliban doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Afghan government. So by failing to involve the Afghan government, and by giving legitimacy to the Taliban as a political entity, the US essentially surrendered to the terms of the Taliban. So as demanded by the Taliban, the Americans agreed to withdraw all their troops, in return for only one guarantee, according to which the Taliban will not allow Afghan soil to be used in the future by terrorist outfits which are looking to target Western countries. By extracting this short-sighted and selfish commitment, the US began withdrawing its troops under the Biden administration without placing any further conditions on the Taliban. The Biden administration made an attempt to open regional dialogue by involving regional powers like Turkey, India, China, Pakistan, and Russia, but these talks have failed. And as Taliban is gaining influence and strength day by day, it's very much expected that by the end of this year, the Taliban would look to regain complete control over Afghanistan by trying to topple the Afghan government, as all the foreign troops would have retreated by the middle of this year. Essentially, the US is leaving behind Afghanistan in a very weak position, where the Taliban has attained the height of its influence, and it would most likely attempt to erase democracy to replace it with its version of Sharia law. These shortcomings of the US strategy in Afghanistan, which dragged the country into a prolonged war, is a direct outcome of its misreading of the situation in Afghanistan. Next, on page number 7, we have two columns, one related to electoral bonds and the other related to cryptocurrencies. We have been covering both these topics repeatedly in the recent weeks, and hence I would request you to go through these columns once. This article on electoral bonds is calling for greater transparency and full disclosure to address the concerns and controversies surrounding electoral bonds. Then this article on cryptocurrencies is appealing to the Indian government to not prohibit or ban the usage of cryptocurrencies, as this strategy would be counterproductive, and it is asking India to draw lessons from the experiences of other countries, and it is making a case for regulation of cryptocurrencies, which would allow us to exploit the benefits offered by cryptocurrencies while dealing with the challenges and risks being raised by the increasing adoption of cryptocurrencies. So since we have covered both the topics repeatedly in the last few weeks, I request you to go through these columns once. Now let's take up an article from page number 8. Large quantities of rice that is sitting with the Food Corporation of India shall be used for ethanol production. See, ethanol or ethyl alcohol is a type of biofuel largely produced through molasses-based products or sugar-based products such as sugarcane. This biofuel is said to be cleaner than traditional fossil fuels, and it can be blended with petrol, diesel, and other traditional fossil fuels to produce a cleaner version of the fuel. Such blending of biofuels will not only reduce the import of crude oil, thus reducing the import bill of India, but it also helps in tackling pollution and in bringing down our greenhouse gas emissions. So, to achieve these objectives, India has come out with a national policy on biofuels, under which India is working towards the ethanol blending target. The target laid out by the government is to achieve 20% blending with petrol by 2025, which is a revised target from the earlier 2030 target under the national policy. And to achieve this ambitious target, the center is trying to double the distilling capacities by 2025. So to achieve these objectives, we can't focus just on molasses-based products, and hence the center is looking to utilize the excess grains that are available with the Food Corporation of India due to bumper crops. And in many cases, these excess stocks will go to waste, and hence the center is looking to boost grain-based ethanol production as well. See, to achieve this ambitious target, the center is looking to produce 1,500 crore liters of ethanol by 2025. And as per the plans laid out under the national policy, at least 740 crore liters out of this should come from grain-based distilleries. And the remainder would come from sugar-based distilleries that make use of molasses. See, as of now, 5% ethanol blending was achieved a couple of years ago, and currently our ethanol blending ratio stands at somewhere around 8.5%. Now the goal is to raise this blending ratio to 20%, and this has to come from both molasses-based production and grain-based production. Currently, India's ethanol capacity stands at just 710 crore liters, out of which just around one-third of it comes from grain-based production, and hardly around 38 crore liters of grain-based ethanol is being used for fuel blending. So the center is looking to make use of the excess grain stocks available with the Food Corporation of India to divert some of these grains towards ethanol production. Under the national policy, maize has been designated as a primary feedstock for producing ethanol, but in this instance, it has directed the Food Corporation of India to divert even rice, which had been procured by the FCI for food security purposes under the PDS or the public distribution system. And since these are excess buffer stocks, the FCI has been directed to divert this rice stock towards grain-based ethanol production industries by offering this rice at a subsidized rate. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967 is India's primary legal weapon against terrorism, but its application has run into controversies on the grounds of violation of fundamental rights. Critically discuss. The second question: the US misread the situation in Afghanistan with the long war now leaving the Taliban at the height of their influence. Examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.